My name is Sarah Martinez, and this is the story of how I learned that gravity isn't the most unforgiving force in the universe. Betrayal is. The last words I spoke to my daughter Emma before deploying to Afghanistan were a promise wrapped in a lie. "I'll be back for your birthday party, Mija," I whispered, holding her small body against mine at the airport. Mommy always keeps her promises. But as I hung suspended 200 feet above the Kunar Valley with 5 Delta Force operators preparing to push me to my death, I realized that keeping that promise would require surviving what no human should survive. 3 weeks before that night, I was sitting across from Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison in the mess hall at Forward Operating Base Salerno, watching him push food around his plate like a man who'd lost his appetite for more than just Army chow. "You know what your problem is, Martinez," Morrison said without looking up, his voice carrying that particular edge I'd learned to recognize in soldiers who were wrestling with ghosts. "Enlighten me," I replied, checking my watch. My spotter specialist, Maria Santos, would be expecting me at the intel briefing in 10 minutes. "You think every decision you make is the right one?" His eyes finally met mine, and I saw something cold and broken swimming in their depths. "You think your tactical brilliance makes you untouchable?" I'd known Morrison for 3 years. We'd served together on Operation Red Thunder, where my decision to abort a helicopter extraction had saved our unit from walking into an ambush. But it had also left Morrison's best friend, Sergeant Kevin Walsh, stranded behind enemy lines for an additional 12 hours before we could mount a rescue. Walsh had made it out alive, but not unchanged. The psychological trauma had been severe enough to end his military career, and Morrison had never forgiven me for making the call that prioritized mission success over immediate extraction. "Jake, we've been through this," I said, keeping my voice steady. "The intel was bad. If we'd proceeded with the original extraction point, Walsh would have been home with his family instead of eating his service pistol in a VA hospital bathroom." Morrison's words hit like physical blows. "Your textbook tactics don't account for what happens to real people, Martinez." I felt my chest tighten. Walsh's suicide 6 months ago had shaken everyone who'd served with him, but I'd never known Morrison blamed me for the chain of events that led to it. "Jake, that's not fair, and you know it. I made the best decision I could with the information available." "The best decision for the mission," he corrected. "Not for Walsh, not for the people who actually mattered." He stood up, leaving his untouched meal on the table. "Funny how your perfect tactical mind always seems to calculate everything except the human cost." That conversation should have been a warning sign, but I was too focused on the current mission to recognize the seeds of betrayal being planted in Morrison's wounded psyche. The briefing that afternoon concerned Ahmad Qasim, a high-value target who'd been coordinating IED attacks throughout the Kunar province. Intelligence indicated he'd be at a compound in the valley, the same valley where I'd been systematically dismantling his smuggling operations for the past 8 months. "We're Martinez." Major Richards addressed me from the front of the room. "You'll provide overwatch from the bird. Your knowledge of the terrain could be crucial if extraction routes need to be adjusted." I frowned. "Sir, with respect, I've led 17 successful operations in that sector. Wouldn't ground leadership make more sense?" Morrison stepped forward before the major could respond. "Delta's taking point on this one, Martinez. Consider it a learning opportunity. You can observe how real operators handle high-value targets." The slight was intentional and public, designed to undermine my authority in front of the assembled team. I caught Maria's eye across the room, and her slight nod told me she'd registered the hostile undertone as well. After the briefing, Maria cornered me outside the operations center. "What the hell was that about?" she asked, lighting a cigarette with hands that weren't quite steady. Morrison's been riding you for weeks. It's about Walsh, I explained, watching Morrison coordinate with his Delta team across the compound. Jake blames me for the call that kept Kevin in country long enough to develop PTSD. That's bullshit and you know it. You saved the entire unit. Try telling Morrison that. I adjusted my rifle sling, a nervous habit I developed over 5 years of combat deployments. He's looking for someone to blame for losing his friend, and I'm convenient. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that Morrison's desire for revenge had evolved beyond simple blame into something much more dangerous. The helicopter lifted off at 2300 hours rotors, chopping through the thin mountain air like mechanical thunder. I positioned myself near the door gunner, supposedly for tactical observation, but really because the location offered the best fields of fire if the situation deteriorated. Morrison sat across from me with his 4 operators, Sergeants Davis, Kelly, Williams, and Thompson. All seasoned professionals, all watching me with expressions I couldn't quite decipher. 20 minutes into the flight, Morrison activated his throat mic and spoke words that would haunt me forever. "Martinez, you know what I've learned about you over the years." "What's that, Jake?" I kept my voice conversational, but my hand drifted instinctively toward my sidearm. "You're too smart for your own good, too calculating. You see people as variables in an equation instead of human beings with families and feelings." His team was shifting position now, subtle movements that looked casual, but had the effect of boxing me in. My father's physics lessons echoed in my mind. For every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. Morrison was applying pressure, which meant he was expecting resistance. "Jake, what's this about?" I asked, though a cold certainty was already crystallizing in my gut. "It's about justice, Martinez. It's about making sure you finally pay for the decisions you've made." His hand moved to his combat knife, the blade catching the dim cabin light. "Walsh isn't the only one who suffered because of your tactical brilliance." "What are you talking about?" Morrison smiled, and it was the most chilling expression I'd ever seen. "Those smuggling routes you've been shutting down, those belong to Ahmad Qasim, sure. But they also belong to people who are paying us very well to keep them open." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. "You're working for the smugglers. Working with them. There's a difference." Morrison's voice carried the conviction of someone who'd rationalized betrayal into righteousness. 50,000 each for removing obstacles to their operations. But for you, Martinez, you're personal. This one's pro bono. I felt the aircraft bank slightly. We were approaching the valley. Davis and Thompson had moved to flank me, their positioning professional and inescapable. "So you throw me out of a helicopter and tell everyone it was equipment malfunction." I kept my voice steady while my mind calculated angles, distances, probabilities. "These mountains are dangerous," Morrison said, reaching for my harness straps. "Accidents happen. Your daughter will get full death benefits, military funeral with honors, everyone wins, except you." The mention of Emma sent ice through my veins. "You bastard." "I'm a bastard who keeps his promises." Morrison replied, the knife beginning to work on my harness. "I promised Walsh I'd make you pay for destroying his life. I promised Qasim I'd eliminate his biggest problem. Tonight, I keep both promises." 4 sets of hands grabbed me, arms, vest, equipment belt, lifting me toward the open door. The night air rushed in, violent and impossibly cold, at 4,200 feet. "You know what, Morrison?" I looked directly into his eyes as he positioned me at the threshold. "My father taught me something important about physics." "What's that?" The knife had finished its work, only their grip kept me from falling. "He said that when someone applies force to you, they transfer their energy. The question isn't whether you'll move, it's what you do with that energy once you have it. They enjoy the physics lesson. Morrison said, then they pushed me into the darkness. Free fall at terminal velocity is approximately 120 miles per hour, but the mind operates on a different timescale entirely. In the 38 seconds I had before impact, I experienced what felt like hours of calculation and memory. My father's voice guided me through the physics. Force equals mass times acceleration, mija. You can't change your mass or gravity's acceleration, but you can influence how that force is distributed over time and surface area. First, priority orientation. I spread my arms and legs into an arch position, turning my body into a controlled airfoil. The valley floor rushed toward me, but panic was a luxury I couldn't afford with Emma's birthday party waiting. Second, priority targeting. Through my night vision goggles, I could see the terrain below ridgelines. I'd memorized valleys I'd patrolled, and there reflecting moonlight like liquid silver, the Allingar River running high with snowmelt. Third priority. Physics. Water from this height would be like hitting concrete, but concrete doesn't compress. Water could if I approached it with the correct angle and technique. 20 seconds remaining. I shifted my body position, tracking toward the deepest section of the river. The goal was to penetrate the surface cleanly and let the water's density gradually absorb my kinetic energy. 10 seconds. I rotated from horizontal to nearly vertical feet first, but angled forward at exactly 45 degrees. This was the crucial calculation: too steep, and I'd drive straight to the bottom like a spear. Too shallow, and I'd skip across the surface, shattering every bone in my body. 5 seconds. The river filled my vision. I could see individual currents, the foam patterns around submerged rocks. At this proximity, I estimated the depth at maybe 18 feet in the center channel. 2 seconds. I took what might be my final breath, tasting the thin mountain air. 1 second, time crystallized into a single moment of perfect physics. Impact. The collision with the water's surface was beyond anything I could have imagined. Even with optimal form and angle, hitting the river from 4,200 feet felt like being struck by a freight train traveling at terminal velocity. The impact drove every molecule of air from my lungs and sent shockwaves through my entire skeleton. My body penetrated the surface and plunged deep into the river's icy heart. But the forces involved were devastating. I felt my left shoulder separate from its socket with an audible pop that somehow carried through the water. Ribs snapped like kindling. I counted at least 4 distinct breaks along my left side. My right knee hyperextended with a tearing sensation that meant significant ligament damage. But worse than the mechanical injuries was the internal damage. I could taste blood in my mouth, probably from a punctured lung. My vision kept blacking out and returning in stuttering fragments, indicating severe concussion. Most dangerous of all was the way my core temperature was plummeting. The river was fed by glacier runoff, probably less than 40 degrees, and my body was already beginning to shut down non-essential systems. I hit the rocky bottom hard enough to leave an imprint in the silt, my spine compressing in ways that sent lightning through my nervous system. For a moment, I couldn't feel my legs at all, and the terror of paralysis almost made me inhale water. But then sensation returned. Agonizing, overwhelming sensation that meant my spinal cord was intact. I kicked off the bottom with legs that barely responded, fighting toward what I hoped was the surface. The current had already carried me 200 meters downstream by the time my head broke through into air. I gasped, choking up river water mixed with blood, my body convulsing from cold and trauma. The shock was shutting down my system faster than I could compensate. My hands were already numb, unable to grip the rocks I clawed at. My core temperature was dropping so rapidly that hypothermia would kill me within minutes if I didn't take immediate action. I managed to drag myself partially onto a gravel bar, then collapsed, my body shutting down from the massive trauma. Every breath sent knives through my punctured lung, and I could feel my blood pressure dropping from internal bleeding. This was where training and preparation saved my life. My emergency medical kit had survived the impact, protected by military-grade waterproofing. Inside was something I'd hoped never to use, an emergency adrenaline injector, designed for combat situations where soldiers needed to function despite catastrophic injuries. With hands that could barely grip the device, I drove the needle into my thigh and depressed the plunger. The effect was immediate and dramatic. My heart rate spiked, my vision cleared, and the excruciating pain became manageable background noise. The adrenaline bought me time, but not healing. I had maybe 30 minutes before the chemical boost wore off, and my body's natural shock response reasserted itself. I used those minutes to perform battlefield triage on myself. First, breathing. I could feel air bubbling through my chest wall where broken ribs had punctured my lung. Using a technique learned in combat medic training, I created a chest seal with plastic from my emergency kit and medical tape, converting the pneumothorax from tension to simple. Second, bleeding. I could feel warm wetness spreading across my abdomen, internal bleeding from the impact. I couldn't repair that in the field, but I could buy time by elevating my legs and applying pressure to my torso with the emergency blanket. Third, temperature. Hypothermia was still the most immediate threat. I stripped off my wet uniform and wrapped myself in the space blanket, then forced myself to perform isometric exercises, despite the agony generating heat through muscle contractions. Fourth, mobility. My left shoulder was dislocated, but not fractured. I could feel the ball of the humerus sitting against my ribs. Using a technique that would have made me scream, if not for the adrenaline, I leveraged my arm against a rock and forced the joint back into its socket. The entire triage process took 12 minutes, leaving me with 18 minutes of chemical enhancement before my body would crash back into trauma-induced shutdown. Above, I could hear the Black Hawk circling back, its rotors cutting through the mountain air like mechanical vultures. Morrison's team would need visual confirmation of my death, and when they couldn't find a body, they'd start hunting. I forced myself to move, following a game trail into the tree line. Every step was agony, despite the adrenaline, my right knee buckling repeatedly where the ligaments had torn. But I'd made Emma a promise, and that promise was stronger than pain, stronger than broken bones, stronger than the logical certainty that I was dying. I found shelter in a cluster of boulders that formed a natural cave, then settled in to wait for dawn. The adrenaline was starting to fade, and waves of nausea and dizziness were washing over me as my body tried to process the massive trauma. My radio was destroyed, smashed during impact. My GPS beacon had survived, but activating it would broadcast my position to everyone, including the men who just tried to murder me. As I huddled in the rocks, feeling my strength ebb with each heartbeat, I began to plan. Morrison and his team thought they'd eliminated their problem. They were about to learn they'd created something far more dangerous, a dying woman with nothing left to lose and a promise to keep. The next 18 hours blurred together in a haze of pain, determination, and tactical planning. I rationed my remaining medical supplies, used snow to reduce swelling in my injured joints, and forced myself to eat energy bars, even though every bite made me vomit. But most importantly, I studied Morrison's team through my binoculars as they searched the crash site. They were professional, methodical, but they were also frustrated. No body meant no confirmation, and no confirmation meant their mission was incomplete. I watched them establish a search pattern, dividing the valley into sectors. They were good, moving with tactical precision, maintaining communication discipline, covering each other's movements. But they were also making assumptions based on the belief that I was either dead or dying. That was their first mistake. On the second day, weakened but functional, thanks to careful medical management and sheer determination, I began my counterhunt. Morrison's arrogance had given me one crucial advantage. He'd underestimated the difference between a soldier fighting for money and a mother fighting to keep a promise. I started with psychological warfare, a single shot from extreme range that took out their communications antenna. The message was clear: I'm alive, I can reach you anywhere in this valley, and I'm coming for you. The hunt that followed played out across 3 days of mountain warfare. I used every skill I'd learned in 5 years of combat operations, every lesson my father had taught me about physics and momentum, every advantage the terrain could provide. I led them deeper into the mountains, always visible enough to keep them following, never close enough for effective engagement. At narrow choke points, I left surprises, not explosive devices, but simple traps that would wound rather than kill, reducing their numbers and slowing their pursuit. When Corporal Williams hit my deadfall trap and tumbled down a 40-foot embankment, breaking his leg in 3 places, they were down to 4 effective operators and had to carry their wounded. When I ambushed their resupply cache and contaminated their water purification tablets with local plant toxins, they started showing signs of dehydration and gastrointestinal distress. When I used their own night vision equipment against them, reflecting infrared laser designators off strategically placed mirrors to blind their targeting systems, they began to understand they weren't hunting a wounded refugee. They were being systematically dismantled by a professional. The final confrontation came on the 4th night in a narrow canyon where the acoustics would carry every word and the terrain favored defense over assault. "Martinez." Morrison's voice echoed off the rock walls, hoarse from exhaustion and frustration. "Enough games. Let's finish this." I emerged from concealment 50 meters away, rifle trained on his position. Even in the darkness, I could see the toll the pursuit had taken, dark circles under his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands that indicated dehydration and stress. "You're right, Jake," I called back. "Let's finish this. But first, I want you to understand something." "What's that?" Walsh didn't kill himself because of what happened on Red Thunder. He killed himself because he couldn't live with what he'd seen, what he'd done, what this war had made him into. That's not tactical failure, that's the price we all pay for serving. Morrison's laugh was bitter and broken. Easy words from someone who never lost anyone that mattered. "I'm about to lose everything that matters if I don't make it home in 12 days, I replied. "My daughter's turning 7, and I promised her I'd be there. That promise is the only thing that's kept me alive since you threw me out of that helicopter." "Then you should have thought of that before you destroyed Walsh's life." "Now, Jake, listen to me. You know you listen." Morrison stepped into the open, his weapon raised. "You think you're some kind of tactical genius, but you're just another soldier who forgot that behind every decision there are real people with real consequences." The standoff stretched between us like a taut wire. In that moment, I could have killed him, should have killed him by any tactical assessment. But killing him wouldn't bring Walsh back, wouldn't undo the betrayal, wouldn't serve justice. Instead, I lowered my rifle. "You're right, Jake. I am responsible for Walsh. Not for his death, but for not seeing his pain soon enough to help him carry it." Morrison's weapon wavered, confusion replacing certainty in his expression. "But throwing me out of a helicopter doesn't balance that scale," I continued. "It just adds more weight to the wrong side." Behind Morrison, I could see his remaining team members emerging from cover, unsure whether this was surrender or strategy. "I'm going home to keep a promise to my daughter," I said, pulling out my emergency beacon and activating it. "You can try to stop me, But understand, I've already survived what should have killed me. I'm not afraid of you, or your bullets, or your guilt. I'm only afraid of disappointing a 7-year-old who believes her mother always keeps her promises. The rescue helicopters arrived 20 minutes later, guided by my beacon signal and the comprehensive intelligence report I'd transmitted using Morrison's own communication equipment. The evidence of their betrayal, recorded conversations, financial transfers, testimony from captured accomplices was overwhelming. Morrison and his surviving team members were taken into custody without resistance. The fight had gone out of them somewhere during those 4 days in the mountains, replaced by the hollow-eyed recognition that their actions had accomplished nothing except their own destruction. The court-martial was swift and decisive. Morrison received life imprisonment for treason, conspiracy, and attempted murder. In his final statement, he looked directly at me and said, "I still blame you for Walsh." "I know," I replied. "But now you get to carry that blame in a concrete cell instead of a battlefield. Maybe it'll be lighter there." I made it home with 6 hours to spare before Emma's birthday party. She was waiting for me at the airport wearing the princess dress we'd picked out together before my deployment. When she saw me walking down the jetway, limping, scarred but alive, she broke free from my mother's hand and ran toward me with arms outstretched. I caught her with my good arm, lifting her despite the protests from my still healing ribs. She wrapped her arms around my neck and held on like she'd never let go. "You kept your promise, Mommy," she whispered. "Rangers always keep their promises, Mija," I whispered back, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and childhood innocence. Even when it's really, really hard. I thought about Morrison's betrayal, about the fall that should have killed me, about 4 days of hunting and being hunted in the mountains of Afghanistan. But mostly I thought about the promise that had pulled me back from the edge of death. "Especially when it's really, really hard," I said. "That's when keeping promises matters most." 6 months later, I received orders to a specialized unit that investigated corruption within military ranks. My experience surviving betrayal and exposing conspiracy had attracted attention from people who understood that sometimes the greatest enemies come from within. As I packed my gear for the new assignment, I found the emergency adrenaline injector that had saved my life, now empty, but still significant. I'd keep it as a reminder that survival isn't just about the equipment you carry or the training you receive. It's about having something worth living for and the absolute refusal to let anyone or anything keep you from getting back to it. Morrison had thrown me from a helicopter, expecting me to disappear into the darkness and silence of death. Instead, he'd taught me that falling isn't the same as failing. Falling is just momentum in an unexpected direction, and momentum can be redirected, controlled, used. The physics of betrayal are complex, but the physics of promise-keeping are elegantly simple. A body in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by an outside force. Morrison thought he was that outside force, but he was wrong. The only force strong enough to stop me was the force that pulled me home, and at the gravity of love, the momentum of promises, kept the unbreakable physics of a mother's word to her child. And that force, I've learned, is stronger than gravity itself.